Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. When Susan suggested that I share with you what I've learned about life and politics that I believe is most relevant, I told her I wasn't convinced I could add significantly to the predictable intelligence of a 92nd Street Y audience. And she took care of that because I think she agreed. She handled it by saying, look, I'm going to reserve a block of time at the end of the evening for the audience to participate. And the longer that period is made, the better. And that will assure us of some intelligent input before you're through. And so I agreed to talk about some of the things that I've learned over the years in my own search for truth and efficacy in life. And I'll try my best to do it as swiftly as possible so that we have the maximum amount of time to deal in the Q&As, because this is a time where I'm sure we all have a lot of questions and we're all eager to find answers. And I suspect a lot of what I say will be familiar to a lot of you regulars at least. I want to make clear that I offer these thoughts not as a seer or a scholar or a philosopher or even as a politician, but as an ordinary New Yorker from South Jamaica and Queens, raised on asphalt streets with brick stoops and stickball games, who was lucky enough to become a lawyer, make a living, marry a wonderful woman, Matilda, who's with me here today, who has always been much more than I deserve, helped raise a family, and then find my way somewhat improbably into the complicated world of politics. Throughout my youth, I was only mildly interested in politics. The things I came to believe in most deeply, I learned from mostly the sweaty example of my immigrant parents' struggle to build a life for themselves and their children, from the nuns at St. Monica's Church in Jamaica, the priests at St. John's University, the great rabbis like Israel Maushowitz and Rabbi Ben Boxer from Queens, and people I met during the Second Vatican Council, and from the enlightened vision and profound wisdom of an extraordinary man who is not well enough known to the people of this nation or this planet. And his name is Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, a French paleontologist who participated in the discovery of Peking man and who understood and believed very deeply in evolution. A soldier who knew the inexplicable evil of the battlefield, a scholar who studied the ages, a philosopher, a Catholic theologian, and a teacher. He reoriented our theology. He rewrote its language, and he linked it inseparably with science. His wonderful books, The Phenomenon of Man and The Divine Milieu, dedicated to those who love this world, made negativism a sin. Teilhard glorified the world and everything in it. He taught us to love and respect ourselves as the pinnacle of God's creation, to this point in evolution at least. He taught us how the whole universe, even the pain and imperfection, is sacred. He taught us in powerful, cogent, and persuasive prose and in soaring poetry. He envisioned a viable and vibrant human future. We are all, he said, foot soldiers in the struggle to unify the human spirit, despite all the disruptions of conflict, war, and natural calamities. Faith, he said, is not a call to escape the world, but to embrace it. Creation is not an elaborate testing ground with nothing but moral obstacles to surmount, but an invitation to join the work of restoration, a voice urging us to be involved in actively working to improve the world that we were born to by our individual and our collective efforts, making it kinder, safer, more loving. If one looks very closely at Teilhard, some of the most fundamental of his principles were then and are now equally available to me and to you and to all rational humans. They can be ascertained by using evidence that's there for all of us to see and feel, with nothing more than the gift of reason and exposure to the world around us, without books or history, without saints or sermons, Without instruction or revelation, two things about our place in the world should occur to us as human beings. The first is that the greatest gift we have been given is our very existence, our life. The second is that since we all share the same principal needs and desires, our intelligence naturally inclines us to treat one another with respect and dignity. The Hebrews, who gave us probably the first of our monotheistic religions, made these ideas the foundation of their beliefs. Tzedakah is the principle that we should treat one another as brother and sister, children of the same great source of life. And Tikkun Olam is the principle that instructs us to join together in repairing the world. Rabbi Hillel points out that these two radiantly logical principles together make up the whole law. All the rest, he said, is commentary. Jesus agreed. It was also the whole law for Christians. The whole law is that you should love one another as you love yourself for the love of truth, and the truth is God made this world but did not complete it, and you ought to be collaborators in creation. Teilhard confirmed for me the intelligence and efficacy of the words of both Hillel and Jesus, as does every religion recognized by this nation. And so from all these sources, my struggling immigrant parents and neighbors, the nuns, the priests, the rabbis, Hillel, Jesus, Teilhard, and Our Lady of the Law, with whom I fell profoundly and irretrievably in love, and my own other life experiences. From all of these, by the mid-'70s, I felt I had all the simple, basic values I needed to build a life for myself and my family. All these values were based ultimately on the two precepts described so elegantly by Teilhard, which amounted really to this: a love of life and a life of love, for oneself and for one another, in the home, in the community, in the world. And altogether, these values seemed right and useful not only for me and my family, but for society and the governments that society creates to rule and guide us. Now, I didn't think in the mid-'70s that I needed a course in political science to teach me what the role of government should be. It seemed to me that all we needed from our government, in addition to all the values I've already mentioned, was a lot of common sense. I didn't fret over whether we should be for big government or small government, and I still don't. It seemed to me clear then, and it does now, that Abraham Lincoln had it right when he said simply, we should have only the government we need, but we should have all the government we need. And with respect to political ideologies, I believe there should be a place for ideology in political policy making, but it shouldn't be first place. First place should go to common sense and benign pragmatism. I say benign pragmatism because with a name like Mario Cuomo, if I said only pragmatism, you would immediately think of the guy who wrote the book on pragmatism and think he was a bad person, which he wasn't. And instead of explaining that all to you, I call it benign pragmatism, which is my way of saying it has to work for the good of the community, the whole community. And that's so much for liberal, or conservative, etc. And those we'll probably get to talk about later. Those labels, I think, are fading very rapidly in significance. It seemed to me clear that government should work to assure us opportunity while insisting that we bear individual responsibility for providing all we can for ourselves, and that government should protect our liberty, our right to live securely, and to express ourselves freely so long as we don't deny anyone else the same right. And it seemed clear, as a matter of common experience and sense, that government should see to it that the productive remain productive and grow even more productive for the good of all of us. It also seemed apparent that there are two major groups that deserve more of government's efforts than they are receiving. The first group consists of those who work for a living because they have to, not because some philosopher or psychiatrist told them it's a good way to fill the grim interval between birth and eternity. They work because they have to. And it also seemed apparent that there are in these two major groups, That's the first. And the second is people who try as hard as they can to get ahead, but for one reason or another, have difficulty doing it. They should be helped by the rest of us. That's essential teod, that's essential religion, it's essential common sense. For my first 2 decades as a lawyer, I tried taking all these basic principles and putting them to work in the small circle of my family and beyond that to the larger community through a series of confrontations with government in court and outside of it on behalf of individuals and small groups who I believed had been dealt with wrongly by government. Some of you may be familiar with some of those things. One of them was mediating a terrible dispute that involved Forest Hills and a specifically Jewish community in Forest Hills, and the attempt to build in their midst here in Forest Hills a huge new development for poor people, most of whom happened to be blacks and African Americans. And that was a terrible, terrible thing that lasted for a long time, and as a matter of fact, ended John Lindsay's opportunity to run for president. I don't know how many of you remember Lindsay and his campaign for president, but he got caught up in this bitter, bitter conflict between a lot of the residents of Forest Hills and the incoming or proposed population. And he actually started his campaign and went to Miami to campaign. And a plane flew over the Miami beaches with smoke that said, "Lindsay is tourist." And the whole world, or at least the whole United States, learned what tourist means. And that was only one. And another was a struggle with Robert Moses, who wanted to take the junkyard owners at Willets Point, who were still there at Willets Point, near what used to be Shea Stadium, but will disappear by next spring. And I represented them. And I represented the people of Corona, who were being taken for a big housing development, and 90 homes were to be taken. And these people had been there for years. One family had been there for 84 years. And this small Corona community had no lawyers. They had no way to deal with this monstrous project being proposed by the city. I represented them for 5 years, and eventually we saved all those homes and stopped the project, which was to be a baseball field. But even after all of that, and getting some notice in the newspapers and a couple of articles by Jimmy Breslin in the New Yorker magazine, we did have some success, and I did get some public notice, but I only got partial satisfaction. It just wasn't enough. What it did do is whet my appetite. It introduced me to government in a very specific way, and how government often fails, and how government could be much better than it is if only we tried a little harder. And I became convinced then that the only way I could help change things significantly was if I became a part of the political system and pushed for my values from inside government. And that's what I did for 20 years. As Secretary of State, Lieutenant Governor with Governor Carey, and Governor for 12 years. In serving, I tried always to remember that all the values I'd been taught by my parents, priests, nuns, and teod are not just fodder for lofty theological contemplation. They're practical, even vital rules that should be part of any political system. And I did everything I could to make them a vital part of my public service, especially as governor, whether it was creating a campaign to fight AIDS, which we had never heard of in 1983. At least I hadn't. Some people in California had heard of it, but I hadn't. HIV and AIDS, it was new to our state. Or a campaign for something else I had never heard of before I was governor, nor had you, nor had the people of the state, and that was a thing called crack cocaine, and homelessness, the worst homelessness since the Depression. I'm working on all those things. I felt that what was operating in me as a motivation were all those basic values that I'd learned years ago. Preventing the death penalty, which was very controversial, still is in this country, regrettably. It is still a favored way to deal with punishment. But for 12 years, I stopped it because I didn't think it was consistent with the values that I had learned. creating the Decade of the Child, led by Matilda, who was then the First Lady, that produced dozens of ways to protect our children, or signing the first seatbelt law in the United States of America. I'm not sure you knew that this state had the first seatbelt law. Every state except New Hampshire has it. And I think New Hampshire's motto is live free or die. I didn't mean that. There was another project that was a favorite of mine and has received very little notice, perhaps even no notice, but it's extremely important. It was to me, it is to the state, and it is sufficiently important so that the Supreme Court has been aware of it and quoted it. A commission, a task force actually, on law and life. And this Commission on Law and Life I proposed because we were learning so many different things in the medical world. The science was advancing so rapidly that we weren't able to keep up with it. And there were issues that it created that the legislature didn't want to handle. Why? They were too sensitive. They dealt too closely with religion and with subjects we didn't understand well. And so I put together a task force, rabbis, priests, ministers, brilliant atheists and agnostics and other people, experts of all kinds, to work on this. And they did. The state of New York didn't have a definition of death in 1983, or 4, or 5. And in 1985, we finally started determining exactly what death was. Is it the heart? Is it the brain? How do you determine a person is dead? The do not resuscitate orders, the organ tissue transplants, the healthcare proxies, surrogate parenting, even some aspects of abortion. The work of the task force was cited by the United States Supreme Court in a number of it. Nobody even knows they're working. It's still in existence, and it has been copied in various places. And it was a reasonable way to deal with some problems that we weren't even thinking of dealing with, and that the political process wouldn't want to deal with. And so I believe with all my heart and all my mind that the principles of tzedakah and tikkun olam and the teachings so elegantly elaborated by Teilhard remain compelling today. Indeed, the need for the strong sense of community that those principles demand is stronger today than it has been for years. We are more fragmented as a nation than we have been for a long time. We have more super wealthy people than ever, but they make up only perhaps 1.5% of our population. A majority of Americans who are working very, very hard and sliding backward economically because their income isn't growing as fast as the costs of health care, education, transportation, housing, and all the other things that they need most. Much more than 10% of our people are unemployed. Much more, because a lot of them don't get counted in the official countings. People who have given up on trying to find a job. And that doesn't account for the people who are working less than they used to and are making less than they used to because they are working fewer hours. 40 million Americans go without health care insurance. 40 million Americans in this, the richest country in the world, go without health insurance. Only 1 out of 4 or 5 of our workers has been able to get educated to the high skill level required by our ever more competitive economy. It's a disaster, our school system. It is a disaster. And it's a failure there is no forgiving. Perhaps 75% of our students in school get through high school. Now think about that. We go to school for I don't know how many days, but there are places in the world where children go to school almost twice as many times a year as our children do. It's a calamity in an economy that every day demands finer skills. We're not producing skilled workers. 11 million children are at risk of poverty. First of all, there are 35 million people, 35.5 million people, I would say, now, who are poor That's more than we had a few years ago. 11 million of them are children. I've said this before to this audience, or at least here at the Y. Those 11 million children, who Matilda works with people in this category, these are children who are at risk of not getting a good education, at risk of being abused, because they need a little bit more guidance than is being provided by whatever their family structure is, and so you need to provide them with mentors. And Matilda does that. She does that here. We did it big time when I was governor, and she was a first lady, and she had, I don't know how many thousands of mentees then. The people who replaced us killed that program, but mentoring is still the best social program that we have for these children at risk. And how much, thank you. And I'll tell you how much at risk they are. You can go to my old neighborhood, South Jamaica, Queens, in the summertime, and you can see kids out on the streets who you might even imagine are too young to be alone out there, but they're there, and they are able to grow up familiar with the sound of gunfire before they've ever heard an orchestra play. Now, there's 11 million of them in this country, and we're not reaching them. We have more incarcerated Americans, more handguns per capita, and more executions than any other industrialized nation. And all of this while we struggle to find ways to end a war in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and find help for the victims of the horrendous earthquake in Haiti, and find a path to peace in the Middle East. If it were clear that our nation lacks the capacity to improve our conditions significantly, if we could say to ourselves honestly here tonight that, yes, Mario, you're right, there is all of that failure, all of that need, but we just can't handle it. We don't have the capacity. It's impossible. If you could say that to yourself tonight, it would be comforting, because then you could pity yourself. But you don't have that luxury, because we know we can do better. And we know we can do much better. How do we know? Just look back a decade or so, a little bit more than a decade or so. This great nation produced 22 million new jobs in that period. It happened to be the period of the Clinton presidency, and a little bit beyond that. 22 million new jobs, regularly balanced budgets, a rising middle class. The middle class was moving up toward the wealthy class, a shrinking number of poor citizens, and a potential surplus, listen to this, a potential surplus of $5.4 trillion. $5.4 trillion potential surplus. And when you look at the terrible deficits we have now, and growing, and threatened to be growing even more rapidly, you have to ask yourself, well, how did we get there? But then you should ask yourself, how did we get to $5.4 trillion surpluses? And how can we do that again? So the number of poor citizens, we were also at peace in that time, except for a short war at Kuwait. And so it's clear that we can do what we must do to make ourselves a more perfect union if we choose to. Because in this country, there is no excuse that we, as the people and the voters, can give ourselves if we're not very, very strong in participating in the system, in recognizing these problems, and in speaking out against them, and in demanding that our politicians do too. It's clear that we can do what we have to do, and if we do not do it, we risk further dividing our nation into the lucky and the left out, a nation that is squandering its opportunity to lend our people and the rest of the world, to lead our people and the rest of the world to a better life. As to whether, as individuals, I and Matilda and all of you should become involved in meeting that challenge in a more vigorous way, well, we should keep in mind, I think, the words of the brilliant agnostic Chief Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who echoed Teilhard's call for vigorous involvement of all of us in the management of the world around us. And he added a warning. He said, as life is action and passion, we are required to share the passion and action of our time at the peril of being judged not to have lived. So, what do I think I've learned in my life that's worth sharing? Well, I've learned the vanity of trying to know and to define fully the infinite and the eternal. That doesn't mean you stop trying to figure it all out, but you know in the end that it's vain. We can't know what we'd like to know about where we come from and where we're going ultimately. And so I've learned that. But I've also learned that in the end, even if my intelligence is too limited for me to know absolutely the truth of things, I can nevertheless choose to believe and call it faith if I must, if that promises me meaningfulness. And for me it does. I can respond to the ancient summons of tzedakah and tikkun olam, knowing that my own religion's faith rests solidly on those same two pillars. And on a more materialistic and practical level, dealing with politics, I can choose to recall the many times our nation has faltered only to rise again, stronger than ever. And I can choose to believe we can do it again. And recalling that, I can choose to believe that despite Massachusetts, with our help, President Obama and our government will soon produce a health care bill that improves our situation to some extent, albeit without satisfying everyone. And I can choose to believe that with our urging, our leaders will help our economy to bounce back as it has from other recessions, and unemployment will be reduced dramatically as it has been before and can be again, can certainly be again. I can also reasonably choose to believe that with our help, this greatest nation in world history, with the world's biggest economy, the most powerful military, and its unique rule of law, can deal with its challenges and ultimately take its place as the global leader that helps lead the whole world to a higher level of peace and civility. And so, it may not be easy to understand Teilhard de Chardin, or believe that God and nature commit us to the endless task of seeking improvement of the world around us, knowing that fulfillment is an eternity away. But for me, I'd rather be committed to those propositions than not. I'd rather believe, because it's better than the anguish of feeling futility, and it's better than the bitterness of despair, and because it brings meaning to our most modest and clumsy efforts. That's a useful consolation for many of us, including for a guy from Queens who has seen a lot of the world and has found more and more reason to believe.